I was reviewing my quarterly financial statement when I noticed it, a withdrawal of $78,000 from my trust fund. Just 3 months before my 30th birthday, when I was supposed to gain full access to the money my grandfather had left specifically for me. There must be some mistake, I told the bank representative over the phone. But there was no mistake. The transfer had been authorized by my mother, the trustee, the same mother who had told me for years that my education would be covered, my down payment secured. The same mother who, I would soon discover, had spent almost my entire inheritance on my sister's extravagant destination wedding in the Maldives. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The afternoon had been ordinary until that moment, a Tuesday. In April, with spring rain tapping against my apartment windows as I sorted through my mail, I wasn't in the habit of scrutinizing my financial statements. My trust fund had always been a background comfort, something I knew would be there when I turned 30, just as my grandfather had intended. He had established separate trusts for both my sister Vanessa and me when we were children, with my mother acting as trustee until we reached the specified age. I had been planning to use the money for a down payment on a house, something modest but my own, in a neighborhood with good schools for the future family I hoped to build. Not extravagant dreams, but meaningful ones that honored my grandfather's intention that we use our inheritances to establish stable foundations for our adult lives. So when I saw the significant withdrawal, $78,000 3 months earlier, my stomach dropped. I immediately called the bank, navigating through the automated system with increasing anxiety until I reached a customer service representative who confirmed what I feared. This was not a clerical error. The withdrawal had been properly authorized by my mother as trustee. But that's not possible, I insisted, my voice tight with restraint. The terms of the trust state that the money can only be used for my education, medical emergencies, or held until I turn 30. I haven't authorized any withdrawals for any purpose. The representative's voice was professionally sympathetic, but firm. According to our records, Ms. Reynolds, the withdrawal was processed under the Extraordinary Circumstances Clause of the trust. Your mother, as trustee, has limited discretion to access funds for necessary expenses that fall outside the standard parameters provided they ultimately benefit the trust beneficiary. Benefit me? I repeated, feeling a cold certainty settling in my chest. What was the stated purpose of this withdrawal? There was a pause, the sound of keys clicking. I'm afraid I don't have that level of detail in my system, Ms. Reynolds. You would need to speak with the trust administrator or directly with the trustee. I thanked her automatically and ended the call, my mind already racing ahead. 3 months ago, January, was exactly when my sister Vanessa had held her destination wedding in the Maldives. A lavish affair for 60 guests at a private island. Resort, with accommodations, catering, and transportation, that had seemed extravagant even for my sister, who had always lived at the upper edge of her income as a pharmaceutical sales representative. My hands shook slightly as I dialed my mother's number. She answered on the 4th ring, her voice distracted. Mom, I said, without preamble, I need to ask you about a withdrawal from my trust fund. The silence that followed was brief, but telling. When she spoke, her voice had shifted to the carefully controlled tone she used when navigating difficult conversations. Alexandra, this isn't a good time. I'm heading into a meeting. $78,000 was withdrawn in January, I continued, ignoring her deflection. Did you authorize that? Another pause, longer this time. We should discuss this in person, not over the phone. Why don't you come for dinner this weekend? I need to know now, I insisted, the tremor in my voice betraying my growing certainty. Was that money used for Vanessa's wedding? It's complicated, Alexandra, she sighed, dropping the pretense. Yes, we needed to cover some unexpected costs for the wedding. The venue increased their fees at the last minute, and we had already committed. Your sister would have been devastated if we had to cancel. I gripped the phone tighter, disbelief, warring with a strange sense of validation, as if a suspicion I had carried for years without fully acknowledging had finally been confirmed. So you took it from my trust fund? Money that grandfather left specifically for me? It was a loan, she said quickly. We've been meaning to discuss the repayment plan with you. Your father and I will replace the funds before you turn 30. You won't even notice it was gone. A loan, I repeated, the word hollow in my mouth. Did you also take a loan from Vanessa's trust fund? The silence that followed told me everything. Of course they hadn't. Vanessa's trust had likely been depleted years ago, given my sister's spending habits and my parents' indulgence of them. My trust fund had been the only remaining resource available to ensure that my sister had the wedding of her dreams, regardless of what it might cost me. Alexandra, my mother began, her tone shifting to one I recognized all too well. Reasonable, slightly wounded, designed to make me question my own reactions. You're making this into something it isn't. Family helps family. Vanessa needed this. You've always been the practical one, the one who makes responsible choices. Your sister isn't like that. She needed our support. The familiar dynamic settled over me with suffocating weight. Vanessa needed. Vanessa couldn't manage. Vanessa would be devastated. And underlying all of it, the unspoken but ever-present assumption, Alexandra can handle disappointment. Alexandra doesn't need as much. Alexandra should understand. That wasn't your decision to make, I said quietly. That money wasn't yours to give. We're your parents, she countered, a hint of steel entering her voice. We've always made decisions with both our daughters' best interests at heart. I almost laughed at the transparent fiction. Both daughters? When have you ever prioritized my interests over Vanessa's? Name one time? That's unfair, she said, but there was a defensive quality to her tone that told me she couldn't readily provide an example. We love you both equally. Equally, I echoed. And yet you took money from my future to fund her wedding. A wedding? Mom, not a medical emergency, not education. A party that she and Eric couldn't actually afford. Weddings are important milestones, my mother insisted. You'll understand when it's your turn. And speaking of that, maybe if you weren't so focused on your career and made time for dating, we'd be planning your wedding too. The familiar deflection stung as intended, but this time, I refused to be diverted from the central issue. This isn't about my personal life. This is about you stealing from me to give to Vanessa. Again. That's an ugly accusation, she said, her voice cooling. I think we both need to take some time to calm down before we continue this conversation. I agree, I said, surprising myself with my composure. I need time, and I need information. Real information, not the sanitized version you're likely to offer over a family dinner, where any disagreement will be characterized as me causing a scene. What does that mean? She asked, wariness creeping into her tone. It means I'm going to request a complete audit of my trust fund from the bank. I want to know if this is the first withdrawal you've made without my knowledge or consent, or just the first one I've caught. Alexandra, that's completely unnecessary, she said quickly. Too quickly. Like I said, we'll replace the money before you turn 30. There's no need to involve the bank in a family matter. Her response, with its immediate resistance and emphasis on keeping the situation within the family, only strengthened my resolve. If there's nothing to hide, there's no reason to object to transparency, I said, repeating a phrase my father had often used in his corporate legal practice. This isn't about hiding anything, she countered. It's about trust and respect. Do you really want to create more division in this family by making accusations and demands? The question was so perfectly calibrated to activate my lifelong role, as peacekeeper, as the one who accommodated to maintain family harmony, that I almost wavered. Almost. Trust and respect work both ways, Mom. I said finally. And right now, I don't feel either from you. I'll be contacting the bank tomorrow to initiate a full investigation into the management of my trust. I ended the call with my mother and sat motionless at my kitchen table, staring at the financial statement that had upended what I thought I knew about my family. The rain outside had intensified, droplets racing down the window in chaotic patterns that matched my thoughts. For 30 years, I had accepted my role within our family dynamic, the responsible one, the reasonable one, the one who understood when plans changed in Vanessa's favor, when resources were redirected to meet her needs, when my desires were deemed less urgent than her demands. I had accepted it because I believed fundamentally in fairness, in the idea that over time, things would balance out. That my parents' decisions, while sometimes tilted toward my sister in the moment, were ultimately guided by a commitment to supporting both their daughters equally, if differently. The trust fund had represented that eventual balance, the assurance that while Vanessa might receive more immediate attention and resources, my future was also being secured. Now that assurance had been shattered, and with it, the narrative I had constructed to make sense of my family relationships. This wasn't a small thing, a missed birthday dinner or a forgotten achievement. This was my inheritance, the financial foundation my grandfather had explicitly designated for me, entrusted to my mother with specific legal instructions about its use and management. I pulled out my laptop and began researching trust fund mismanagement. The information was overwhelming, a labyrinth of legal terms and procedures that made my head spin. But one thing became clear. As a beneficiary, I had rights, including the right to demand an accounting of how the trust had been managed. By morning, I had drafted an email to the trust department at my bank, requesting a complete audit of all transactions related to my trust fund since my grandfather's death 15 years ago. The response came more quickly than I expected. A trust officer named Marcus Delaney would be handling my case, and he had scheduled a preliminary meeting for 2 days later to discuss the scope of the investigation. I had taken the day off work, unwilling to navigate this conversation between meetings or during my lunch break. Some things deserved undivided attention, and reclaiming my financial autonomy was one of them. Marcus was younger than I had expected, perhaps in his mid-30s, with wire-rimmed glasses and the precise manner of someone who took his responsibilities seriously. He welcomed me into a small conference room at the bank, a manila folder and laptop already arranged on the table. "Ms. Reynolds," he began, "I've reviewed your initial request and the basic structure of your trust. Before we proceed, I want to make sure you understand what an audit like this entails and what we can and cannot do as your financial institution." I appreciated his directness. "I understand that this may be complex," I said, "but I need to know if funds have been mismanaged, and if so, to what extent." Marcus nodded. "The irrevocable family trust established by Edward Reynolds designates you as the primary beneficiary, with your mother, Caroline Reynolds, serving as trustee until you reach the age of 30 or under certain other conditions specified in the trust documents. As trustee, your mother has fiduciary responsibilities, which include managing the assets prudently and solely for your benefit." "Which she violated by withdrawing money for my sister's wedding," I said, the words still difficult to speak aloud. "That's what we'll need to determine," Marcus said carefully. "The trust does contain an extraordinary circumstances clause that grants the trustee limited discretion for withdrawals outside the standard parameters, but such withdrawals must still ultimately benefit the beneficiary." "How could my sister's wedding possibly benefit me?" I asked, unable to keep the edge from my voice. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "That's a valid question," he acknowledged, "and one that would need to be addressed if we find the withdrawal was indeed used for that purpose. What I can tell you is that we take our role as the custodian of trust assets Seriously, if there has been mismanagement, we have procedures to address it. Over the next hour, Marcus explained the audit process. The bank would review all transactions, looking for patterns or irregularities. They would request documentation for withdrawals, particularly those made under the Extraordinary Circumstances Clause. If necessary, they could freeze further withdrawals pending the outcome of the investigation. "And how long will this take?" I asked, thinking of my approaching birthday and the plans I had made based on accessing my trust. "We'll conduct the initial review within 2 weeks," Marcus said. "That should give us a clear picture of any irregularities. If we find evidence of mismanagement, the remediation process can take longer, depending on the complexity and whether legal action becomes necessary." Legal action. The phrase hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. Was I prepared to take legal action against my own mother? The thought made my stomach clench, but then I remembered her dismissive tone, her immediate defense of the indefensible, her assumption that I would eventually fall back into my accustomed role of understanding and accommodation. "I need to know the truth," I said finally. "Whatever it is, however uncomfortable it might be." Marcus's expression softened, slightly. "That's what we're here to help you discover, Ms. Reynolds." As I left the bank, I felt a curious mixture of dread and determination. The process had been set in motion, and there would be no going back to the comfortable ignorance of before. Whatever the investigation revealed, I would have to face it. And so would my family. I hadn't spoken to either of my parents or my sister since the initial phone call with my mother. My phone had accumulated multiple missed calls and increasingly urgent text messages, but I had maintained my silence, unwilling to engage until I had more information. This wasn't a situation that could be smoothed over with carefully worded apologies or appeals to family unity. This was about trust in its most fundamental form, both financial and emotional, and that trust had been profoundly violated. On the third day after my meeting with Marcus, my sister appeared at my apartment door unannounced. Vanessa had always been the more conventionally beautiful of us, taller, blonder, with the kind of effortless confidence that drew attention in any room. But today, she looked uncharacteristically disheveled, her expression a mixture of indignation and unease. "You can't just ignore everyone," she said as soon as I opened the door. "Mom is falling apart, Dad is barely speaking, and I'm caught in the middle of whatever this is." I stepped back to let her in, noting with a detached sort of interest that even now, she positioned herself as the victim in a situation that had literally cost me tens of thousands of dollars. "This," I said quietly, closing the door behind her, "is me discovering that my trust fund was used to pay for your wedding without my knowledge or consent." Vanessa's expression flickered, a momentary hesitation before she rallied. "That's between you and Mom. I didn't even know where the money came from. I just told them the final costs, and they handled it." "Did you ever ask how they were handling it?" I countered, moving to the kitchen to put the kettle on, a habitual response to tension that I recognized even as I performed it. "Did you wonder how our parents, who have been semi-retired for 3 years, suddenly had an extra $78,000 for last-minute venue fees and expanded guest lists?" She followed me, leaning against the counter with arms crossed defensively. "They've always managed. That's what parents do. They figure things out for their kids." "For some of their kids," I corrected her, measuring tea leaves into the infuser with precise movements that helped steady my hands. "They figure things out for you, Vanessa. They've always figured things out for you, even when it comes at my expense." Her expression hardened. "That's not fair. It's not my fault that I've needed more help sometimes. We're different people, with different lives." "You're right," I agreed, surprising her. "We are different. I calculated what I could afford for my education and chose my university accordingly. You insisted on going to Westmore despite the higher tuition and lived in an off-campus apartment that cost twice what my dorm did. I worked part-time throughout college to cover my expenses. You called home whenever you ran short, and they always sent money. I planned my career moves carefully, building experience and credentials. You changed jobs whenever you felt unfulfilled, and they supported you through each transition. The kettle whistled, and I poured hot water over the tea leaves, the familiar ritual at odds with the unprecedented confrontation unfolding in my kitchen. "So what? You've been keeping score all these years," Vanessa demanded, color rising in her cheeks. "Tallying up every penny they've spent on me versus you? That's incredibly petty, Alexandra." I set 2 mugs on the counter, the steam rising between us like the heated words we were exchanging. "It's not about keeping score. It's about recognizing a pattern that I've spent my entire life explaining away. Every time resources were directed toward you instead of me, every time my needs were minimized or postponed while yours were treated as urgent, I told myself it was temporary, that it balanced out over time. The trust fund was part of that equation, the assurance that while you might get more now, my future was also being secured." "And it is," she insisted, picking up the mug but not drinking from it. "Mom said they're going to pay it back before." "You turn 30. You won't lose anything." "That's not the point, Vanessa," I said, feeling suddenly tired. "The point is that they made a unilateral decision to use money that was explicitly designated for me, without my knowledge or consent, money that was never theirs to give. And they did it for something that was completely discretionary. A luxury wedding that you and Eric chose to have, knowing it exceeded your budget." Vanessa set the mug down with a sharp click against the counter. "So this is about my wedding? You're jealous because I had the wedding you haven't managed to have yet?" The accusation was so wildly off-target that I almost laughed. This is about trust and respect, about recognizing that I'm an adult with the right to make my own financial decisions, not a resource to be tapped whenever you or our parents decide. Your desires outweigh my needs. Vanessa left my apartment in a storm of indignation, slamming the door behind her with enough force to rattle the pictures on my wall. I remained in the kitchen, hands wrapped around my cooling tea, feeling oddly calm despite the confrontation. For the first time in our adult relationship, I had spoken plainly about the inequities that had shaped our family dynamic, without softening my words to protect her feelings or preserve an artificial harmony. The week that followed passed with excruciating slowness. I immersed myself in work, grateful for the complex healthcare policy analysis that required my complete attention. My colleagues at the public health nonprofit where I served as a research director noticed my distraction, but respectfully maintained their distance, perhaps sensing that my terse explanation of family matters was all I could manage. On Friday afternoon, as I was preparing to leave the office, my phone rang with the bank's number. Marcus Delaney's voice was carefully neutral when I answered. "Ms. Reynolds, we've completed the preliminary review of your trust. I think it would be best if we discuss the findings in person. Would you be available to come in tomorrow morning?" My heart rate accelerated. "Is it that serious?" There was a slight pause. "Let's just say the situation is more complex than a single withdrawal for a wedding. I'd prefer to walk you through the details directly." I agreed to meet him at 10 a.m. the following day, then spent a restless night cycling between anxiety and a strange, detached curiosity. Whatever Marcus had discovered, it would finally provide clarity. Uncomfortable, perhaps even painful clarity, but the truth nonetheless. The bank was quiet on Saturday morning, the trust department nearly empty except for a few professionals catching up on work. Marcus greeted me with the same formal courtesy as before, but I detected a new gravity in his demeanor as he led me to the same conference room. "Thank you for coming in, Ms. Reynolds," he began once we were seated. "As I mentioned, we've completed our initial review of your trust, focusing particularly on withdrawals made under the Extraordinary Circumstances Clause." He opened a folder containing several spreadsheets and summary documents. "I'll be direct. We've identified multiple unauthorized withdrawals dating back approximately 8 years. The total sum diverted from your trust amounts to just over $342,000. The number hit me with physical force, momentarily stealing my breath. $342,000? I finally managed. That's more than half of what should be in the trust. Marcus nodded grimly. Based on the original assets and projected growth, your trust should currently hold approximately $620,000. Instead, the balance stands at $278,324. I stared at the figures on the spreadsheet he turned toward me, each line representing a withdrawal that had systematically depleted my future security. And these were all authorized by my mother? As trustee? Yes. Each withdrawal was processed with her authorization, citing the extraordinary circumstances. Clause. However, he continued, his tone shifting slightly, our investigation found concerning irregularities in how these withdrawals were documented and justified. He pointed to the earliest significant withdrawal, dated 8 years earlier. $47,000 ostensibly for medical expenses not covered by insurance. I wasn't ill 8 years ago, I said, frowning. I was 22, just starting my master's program. I was on the university health plan, and I never had any major medical issues. Exactly, Marcus said. We requested documentation for all major withdrawals, as is standard procedure for an audit. For this particular transaction, the supporting documentation provided was a series of invoices from Lakeside Rehabilitation Center. The name was vaguely familiar, though I couldn't immediately place it. Then the connection surfaced. That's where my cousin Trevor went for addiction treatment. Marcus's expression remained professionally neutral. We cannot confirm who received treatment, as that would be protected medical information. However, I can confirm that the invoices were not for services provided to you. The implications slowly crystallized. My mother had used my trust fund, money specifically designated for my future, to pay for my cousin's rehabilitation. Trevor was my father's nephew, not even directly related to my mother. Is that legal? I asked, struggling to process the revelation. It represents a clear breach of fiduciary duty, Marcus explained. A trustee is legally obligated to manage the trust solely for the benefit of the named beneficiary, in this case, you. Using trust assets to pay for medical treatment for another family member, regardless of the circumstances, violates that fundamental obligation. He turned the page to reveal more withdrawals. $29,000 for educational expenses, when I had already completed my master's degree on scholarship. $63,000 for housing security during a period when I was renting a modest apartment and had never requested housing assistance. $54,000 for emergency transportation and accommodations that coincided with my parents' extended stay in Barcelona after my father's unexpected heart episode during their European vacation. Each entry represented a fabrication, a diversion, of resources that had been explicitly designated for my future. And most painfully, each represented a conscious choice by my mother to prioritize other needs, Vanessa's, my father's, even extended family members, over her fiduciary responsibility to me. The most recent withdrawal for the wedding is actually one of the more straightforward cases, Marcus continued. At least it was documented as a loan, though there's no formal repayment agreement in place. I struggled to find words adequate to the magnitude of what I was learning. So for 8 years, my mother has been systematically depleting my trust fund to cover family expenses that have nothing to do with me? That appears to be the case, Marcus confirmed. And while the trust does grant the trustee some discretion for extraordinary circumstances, there must still be a clear benefit to you as the beneficiary. None of these withdrawals meet that standard. What happens now? I asked, the question encompassing far more than just the financial implications. Marcus outlined the bank's next steps. They would freeze the remaining assets to prevent further withdrawals, They would formally notify my mother of the audit findings and the breach of fiduciary duty. They would request her voluntary resignation as trustee. If she refused to resign, they would petition the court for her removal and the appointment of an institutional trustee, the bank itself, to manage the remaining assets. And the money that was taken? I asked, still struggling to fully absorb the magnitude of the betrayal. That's more complicated, Marcus acknowledged. You have legal grounds to seek recovery of the misappropriated funds from the trustee personally. However, pursuing that route would likely require litigation against your mother. The word hung between us: litigation, a formal legal battle against my own mother. The thought was nearly unbearable. Yet so was the alternative, accepting that more than half of my inheritance, my grandfather's explicit gift to secure my future, had been redirected to address other family members' needs and wants without my knowledge or consent. I need time to think, I said finally. Marcus nodded, understanding. Of course. These are significant decisions that shouldn't be rushed. But Ms. Reynolds, he added, his professional demeanor softening slightly, I do want to emphasize that what happened here was wrong. Not just legally wrong, but fundamentally unfair to you as the intended beneficiary of your grandfather's generosity. Whatever you decide about pursuing recovery, please don't question your right to feel betrayed by these actions. His validation, coming from a neutral professional with no stake in our family dynamics, steadied me. This wasn't about me being petty or ungenerous or failing to understand the complexity of family finances. This was about a systematic pattern of prioritizing others' needs at my expense, not just emotionally, as had been the case throughout my childhood, but financially, in direct violation of legal obligations and explicit instructions. As I left, the bank, clutching the folder containing documentation of years of financial betrayal, I felt strangely weightless. The truth, however painful, had liberated me from the exhausting work of explaining away inconsistencies, of constructing narratives that allowed me to believe in fundamental fairness, despite mounting evidence to the contrary. I didn't go straight home. Instead, I drove to Halcyon Park, a peaceful green space overlooking the river that had been my refuge during difficult times since college. I found an empty bench facing the water and sat, letting the spring sunlight warm my face as I contemplated what came next. My phone vibrated in my pocket, my mother again, likely wondering why I still hadn't responded to her increasingly urgent messages. I silenced it without looking at the screen. This conversation wouldn't happen on her timeline, driven by her anxiety about exposure. It would happen when I was ready, with full information and clear boundaries. For now, I needed to sit with the magnitude of what I had learned. Not just the financial betrayal, though that was substantial enough, but the deeper pattern it revealed, the consistent choice to prioritize others' needs and wants over commitments made to me, the assumption that I would understand, accommodate, adjust my expectations while others remained secure in theirs. A pair of geese floated past on the river, their movements synchronized in the current. They reminded me of my grandfather, his quiet strength, his careful planning, his determination to provide for both his granddaughters equally. He had established identical trusts for Vanessa and me, believing that we would both benefit from this foundation as we built our adult lives. What would he think of how his intentions had been subverted? Of how the security he had carefully arranged for me had been systematically redirected to address other priorities, some legitimate needs, others mere preferences? The question crystallized my resolve. This wasn't just about me and my financial security, though that mattered. It was about honoring my grandfather's explicit intentions, about respecting the careful planning he had done to support both his granddaughters equally. In allowing my trust to be depleted while protecting Vanessa's, my parents had not only betrayed me, they had betrayed him and his clearly expressed wishes. That realization settled in me with surprising calm. Whatever came next difficult conversations, formal proceedings, potential litigation, I would approach it not from a place of wounded anger, but from a commitment to truth and to honoring intentions that had been explicitly established. This wasn't about punishing my parents or forcing acknowledgement of years of unequal treatment. It was about establishing clarity and ensuring that what remained of my grandfather's gift would be protected as he had intended. 3 days after my meeting with Marcus, I requested a formal sit-down with my parents. After careful consideration, I decided their home would be the most appropriate setting. Neutral ground might have been easier emotionally, but this conversation deserved the privacy that only a family home could provide. I specifically asked that Vanessa not be present. This phase of the discussion needed to be contained to the primary parties involved: my mother as trustee, my father as her enabler, and myself as the beneficiary whose inheritance had been systematically diverted. I arrived at their suburban colonial at precisely 6 o'clock on a Wednesday evening, the folder of bank documents tucked into my leather portfolio. The house looked exactly as it always had, meticulously maintained, with seasonal flowers in the front beds and warm light spilling from the windows. It struck me as incongruous that a place could appear so unchanged when my understanding of the relationships it contained had been so fundamentally altered. My father opened the door before I could ring the bell. Richard Reynolds had always been an impressive figure. Tall, silver-haired, with a commanding presence cultivated during his years as corporate counsel for a multinational firm. But today he looked diminished somehow, worry lines etched more deeply around his eyes. "Alexandra," he said, his tone formal in a way that confirmed he understood the gravity of the situation. "Thank you for coming." "Thank you for agreeing to meet," I replied, equally formal. The familiar impulse to smooth things over, to reassure him that everything would be fine, rose automatically before I consciously suppressed it. This was not a time for reflexive comforting. He led me to the living room where my mother waited, perched on the edge of the sofa as if ready to flee at the first sign of conflict. Caroline Reynolds had always been the family's emotional barometer, the one who managed relationships, who ensured that social appearances were maintained regardless of underlying tensions. Today she looked both defensive and defeated, a combination that would have triggered my immediate sympathy in the past. "Would you like something to drink?" my father asked, falling back on social ritual when genuine connection felt uncertain. "No, thank you," I said, taking a seat across from them. "I appreciate you both making time for this conversation. I know it won't be easy, but it's necessary." My mother's hands twisted in her lap. "Alexandra, before you say anything, I want you to know that we never intended to hurt you. Every decision we made was with the family's best interests at heart." The familiar framing, the family's best interests, struck me differently now. How often had that phrase been used to justify decisions that served some family members at the expense of others? How often had I accepted it as sufficient explanation for outcomes that consistently disadvantaged me? "I've met with the bank," I said directly, opening my portfolio and placing the summary sheet on the coffee table between us. "They've completed an audit of my trust fund." My father leaned forward to examine the document, his lawyer's instinct for assessment overriding his personal discomfort. My mother remained rigidly upright, her gaze fixed on me rather than on the evidence of her actions. $342,000, I continued, the number still shocking despite my having lived with it for days now. "That's how much has been withdrawn from my trust under the extraordinary circumstances clause over the past 8 years. Money that was explicitly designated for my future, diverted to cover everything from Vanessa's wedding to Trevor's rehabilitation to your extended stay in Barcelona after Dad's heart episode." My father's expression tightened as he scanned the itemized withdrawals. My mother's complexion had gone pale, but she rallied with the defense she had likely been rehearsing since my initial discovery. Alexandra, you have to understand. These were family emergencies. Trevor might have died without treatment. Your father needed me with him during his recovery. Vanessa's wedding was not an emergency, I finished firmly. Neither was Dad's. Business class upgrade for the flight home from Spain, or the semester abroad for Vanessa's stepdaughter, or any of the other discretionary expenses listed there. We've always taken care of this family's needs, my father interjected, his tone taking on the authoritative edge he had used throughout my childhood to end uncomfortable discussions. Sometimes that requires difficult decisions about resource allocation. Resource allocation, I repeated, the clinical phrasing bringing unexpected clarity. That's exactly what this has been, hasn't it? A consistent pattern of allocating resources away from me and toward others, particularly Vanessa. The difference is that my trust fund wasn't yours to allocate. It was designated specifically for me, with legally binding constraints on how it could be used. My mother's expression hardened. We are your parents. We have always acted in your best interest. By taking more than half of my inheritance without my knowledge or consent? I challenged, keeping my voice level despite the emotion rising in my chest. By systematically depleting the financial security my grandfather explicitly established for me? We intended to replace those funds, my father said, though his tone lacked conviction. Your mother has already explained that the wedding expenses will be repaid before your birthday. And the other $264,000, I asked, were you planning to replace that as well? Or did you assume I would never notice, never request an accounting, never realize that the security I had been counting on had been redirected to meet other family members' needs and wants? My mother's composure cracked slightly. You've always been the stable one, Alexandra. The one who plans, who saves, who makes careful decisions. Vanessa needed more support. Because you and Dad never required her to develop financial responsibility. I interrupted, a lifetime of accumulated insight suddenly crystallizing. You cultivated her dependence through your constant intervention, just as you cultivated my independence by consistently directing resources toward her rather than me. And then you used the very self-sufficiency you forced me to develop as justification for continuing to prioritize her needs over mine. The observation landed with visible impact. My parents exchanged a glance that contained decades of unspoken understanding, the tacit agreement about which daughter needed more, which could manage with less, which would understand when plans changed in the other's favor. That's not fair, my father said, but the protest sounded hollow even to him. What's not fair, I replied steadily, is discovering at 29 that the financial foundation I had been counting on, that I had structured my career choices, housing decisions, and future plans around, has been systematically dismantled to address other priorities that you deemed more important than your legal and ethical obligations to me. My mother's expression shifted from defensive to wounded. After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us? With accusations and legal threats? The familiar tactic, positioning herself as the injured party when confronted with the consequences of her own actions, no longer had the power to derail me from my purpose. I haven't made any legal threats, I said calmly. I've simply stated facts established through a formal bank audit. But since you've raised the issue, I should inform you that the bank has frozen the remaining trust assets to prevent further, unauthorized withdrawals, and they've requested your voluntary resignation as trustee due to the documented breach of fiduciary duty. My father's legal training asserted itself through his personal distress. They can't unilaterally remove Caroline as trustee. The trust documents specify a process for trustee replacement. You're right, I acknowledged. If she refuses to resign voluntarily, they'll petition the court for her removal and the appointment of an institutional trustee to manage the remaining assets. They believe the evidence of fiduciary breach is sufficient to warrant judicial intervention. The clinical terms, fiduciary breach, judicial intervention, created a necessary distance from the painful personal reality underlying them. My mother had betrayed her legal obligation to protect my interests, and now external authorities might be required to enforce the consequences of that betrayal. "This will destroy our family," my mother said, tears forming in her eyes. "Is that what you want, Alexandra? To tear us apart over money?" The question was so profoundly inverted that I almost laughed despite the gravity of the moment. "This isn't about money, Mom. It's about trust, about respect, about acknowledging that I deserve the same consideration you've always given Vanessa. You and Dad are the ones who made choices that put our family relationship at risk. Every time you diverted funds that weren't yours to divert, every time you prioritized others' wants over your legal obligation to me, every time you assumed I would simply understand and accept whatever you decided was best." My father had lapsed into an attorney's analytical mode, examining the document with growing recognition of its legal implications. "We could arrange a repayment plan," he said, finally. "Structure it over several years, with interest to compensate for lost growth. Do you have $342,000 available to repay immediately?" I asked directly. His hesitation was answer enough. My parents had been semi-retired for 3 years, living primarily on investment income and my father's consulting work. They had never been reckless with money, but they had consistently lived at the upper end of their means, prioritizing appearances and experiences over building substantial reserves. "We would need time," he admitted, "and we'd likely need to liquidate some assets." "Including the vacation property in Vermont?" I asked, referring to the lakeside cabin that had been in my father's family for generations. A property that, I now realized with sudden clarity, would one day pass primarily to Vanessa rather than being divided equally between us. The flash of alarm in his eyes confirmed my suspicion. "That property is family legacy, not liquid assets," he said stiffly. "So is my trust fund," I countered. "My grandfather established it as my legacy, my foundation for building financial security. Yet you and Mom felt entitled to redirect it toward priorities you deemed more important." My mother had moved from tears to anger, her emotional progression following the familiar pattern I had witnessed throughout childhood disputes. "You've changed, Alexandra. The daughter I raised would never turn against her family like this, would never prioritize money over relationships." "I haven't changed," I said quietly. "I've just stopped accepting that my needs and interests should always be subordinate to others. I've stopped believing that being a good daughter means allowing my future security to be compromised without my knowledge or consent. I've stopped participating in a family dynamic that consistently positions me as the one who should understand, accommodate, and sacrifice, while others' needs and wants are treated as paramount." The silence that followed was heavy with decades of unacknowledged patterns, of implicit understandings that had shaped our family interactions so profoundly that they had become nearly invisible, except to the person consistently disadvantaged by them. "What do you want from us, Alexandra?" my father finally asked, his tone a mixture of resignation and calculation, the attorney assessing potential settlement terms. I had considered this question carefully in the days following my meeting with Marcus. What did I want? Financial restitution, certainly, the restoration of resources that had been wrongfully diverted. But beyond that, I wanted something more fundamental: recognition. Acknowledgement of the patterns that had shaped our family dynamic, of the consistent prioritization of others' needs and wants over commitments made to me, of the assumption that I would always understand, always accommodate, always adjust my expectations, while others remained secure in theirs. "I want 3 things," I said with a clarity that surprised even me. "First, Mom's immediate resignation as trustee of my trust, to be replaced by the bank's trust department. Second, a formal repayment agreement for the misappropriated funds, structured over time if necessary, but with appropriate interest and collateral to ensure completion. And third, acknowledgement, genuine recognition, of the pattern of unequal treatment that made these financial diversions seem acceptable to you both. My parents stared at me across the living room, the air between us heavy with unspoken history. My mother's face registered shock, as if she couldn't believe I had the audacity to make specific demands rather than accept whatever resolution they deemed appropriate. My father, ever the strategist, was already calculating, his eyes narrowed, as he weighed options and potential outcomes. "Alexandra," he began carefully, "I understand your frustration, but a formal repayment agreement is unnecessarily adversarial. We're family. We can handle this between ourselves without involving third parties." I had anticipated this response, the appeal to family connections as a way to avoid formal accountability, the suggestion that external structures were inappropriate for resolving family matters. It was the same reasoning that had allowed the pattern of inequality to persist unchallenged for decades. This situation exists precisely because informal family understandings failed, I replied calmly. The trust had formal legal parameters that were systematically disregarded because you and Mom assumed I would never question your decisions, never demand the same consideration given to others. I'm not willing to rely on informal agreements anymore. My mother had regrouped, her initial shock hardening into something more defensive. "You're treating us like criminals," she said, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "Everything we did was for this family. I'm treating you like adults who made choices with significant consequences," I corrected her. "Choices that violated both legal obligations and personal trust. And again, Mom, this family seems to consistently exclude me when decisions are made but include me when sacrifices are required." Something in my steady tone, the absence of the emotional reactivity they had likely expected, seemed to penetrate their defenses. My father sighed, setting aside the summary sheet with a gesture of reluctant acceptance. "The trustee resignation is straightforward," he conceded. "Given the documented irregularities, it's the appropriate legal step. The repayment is more complicated. We'll need to assess our assets, develop a structured plan." He trailed off, the financial reality of what they had done finally asserting itself beyond abstraction. Over $340,000 diverted from my trust, money that should have been generating returns for my future, financing my first home, providing the security my grandfather had explicitly intended for me. "The bank's trust department can work with you to develop a reasonable repayment structure," I said, maintaining the professional tone that had proven effective. "They understand this is a complex family situation." My mother had been uncharacteristically quiet, but now she leaned forward, her expression shifting from defensive to pleading. "Alexandra, surely you can see that we never meant to hurt you. We were trying to balance everyone's needs." "By consistently prioritizing others over me," I said, not unkindly but without yielding. "By assuming I would understand, accommodate, adjust while Vanessa and others received immediate attention and resources. That pattern didn't start with my trust fund, Mom. It's been the defining dynamic of our family relationships for as long as I can remember." "That's not true," she protested, but without conviction. "We've always loved you both equally." "Equal love doesn't necessarily translate to equal treatment," I observed. "You may have loved us equally in theory, but in practice, your decisions consistently favored Vanessa's immediate wants over my long-term needs." My father, always more pragmatic, seemed to recognize the truth in my assessment. "We may have overcorrected," he admitted reluctantly. "Vanessa struggled more, needed more intervention. You were always so capable, so independent." "I became independent because I had to," I pointed out, "because experience taught me early that my needs wouldn't receive the same immediate attention, that I needed to solve my own problems while family resources were directed toward Vanessa's." It was the most honest conversation we had ever had about the dynamics that had shaped our family. And despite the painful context, I felt a curious sense of relief. The patterns had finally been named, the invisible currents that had directed our relationships for decades, finally acknowledged out loud rather than remaining powerful but unspoken influences. "What about your third requirement?" my father asked after a moment of weighted silence. "Acknowledgement, you said. What exactly does that entail?" The question was genuine, and his willingness to ask it, to explore unfamiliar emotional territory rather than retreating to legal frameworks or financial calculations, marked a subtle but significant shift. "I need you both to recognize that what happened with my trust fund wasn't an isolated financial decision," I explained. "It was the extension of a lifelong pattern where my needs were consistently subordinated to others, where I was expected to understand and accommodate while Vanessa was protected from natural consequences and given disproportionate resources and attention." My mother's expression tightened. "You make it sound so calculated, so intentional. We were just responding to the situations that arose." "The situations may have been circumstantial, but your responses followed a consistent pattern," I said. "When resources were limited, mine were the first sacrificed. When attention was divided, Vanessa's needs were prioritized. When plans changed, I was the one expected to adjust without complaint. These weren't random choices. They reflected underlying assumptions about which daughter's needs and wants mattered most." The articulation of this pattern, clear, direct, without accusation but without qualification, landed with visible impact. My parents exchanged a glance that conveyed decades of shared understanding, of tacit agreements about how our family operated. "We never saw it that way," my father said finally, his tone softened by genuine reflection. "We thought we were responding to each situation as it came, making the best decisions we could with the resources available." "I believe that's how you experienced it," I acknowledged. "But from my perspective, the cumulative effect was a clear message about my place in the family hierarchy, as the one who should understand, accommodate, sacrifice so that others could receive what they wanted or needed." My mother's defenses were crumbling now, her carefully maintained facade of family harmony giving way to genuine, if reluctant, recognition. "I didn't. We didn't," she began, then stopped, uncharacteristically at a loss for words. "You didn't consciously intend to establish that pattern," I finished for her. "I understand that. But intention doesn't negate impact. And the impact on me, on my sense of worth within this family, on my understanding of what I could expect, or request on my financial security, has been significant." The room fell silent again, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was no longer tense with unspoken conflicts and defensive positioning, but quieter, more reflective, a space for genuine consideration rather than strategic response. "Where do we go from here?" my father asked finally, his tone more personal, then professional for the first time in our conversation. "How do we fix this?" The question was both practical and profound. How does a family repair patterns established over decades, behaviors so ingrained they've become nearly invisible to those perpetuating them? How do you rebuild trust when its very foundation has been revealed as fundamentally unsound? "We start with honesty," I said, "with acknowledging what happened rather than minimizing or justifying it, with recognizing patterns rather than treating each incident as isolated or exceptional, with accepting that rebuilding trust requires more than promises. It requires consistent action over time that demonstrates new priorities and approaches." My mother wiped away tears that had finally spilled over. "I never meant for you to feel less important, less valued," she said, her voice wavering but sincere. "You were always so capable, so self-sufficient. I thought that meant you needed less from us, not that we were giving you less than you deserved." "I became self-sufficient because I had to," I repeated, but gently this time. Because I learned early that being low maintenance was the only way to receive positive attention in this family. Vanessa's needs created crisis and immediate response. My careful planning and independent problem-solving meant I rarely created those crisis moments that mobilized family resources. My father nodded slowly, a dawning recognition visible in his expression. And then we used that very self-sufficiency we had required of you as justification for continuing to direct resources toward Vanessa. Yes, I said simply. The acknowledgement, straightforward, unqualified, felt like a first step across a threshold I had never expected to cross with my parents. Not complete understanding, certainly not immediate transformation of lifelong patterns, but a genuine recognition that might serve as foundation for something new. I'll contact our attorney tomorrow about the trustee resignation, my father said after another moment of contemplation. And we'll work with the bank on a formal repayment structure. But, Alexandra, he added, his tone softer than I had heard it in years. Beyond the legal and financial aspects, I want you to know that I hear what you're saying about the patterns. I can't promise immediate perfection in changing habits established over decades, but I do commit to being more conscious of these dynamics moving forward. My mother reached for my hand across the coffee table, her fingers trembling slightly. I'm sorry, she said simply. Not just for the trust fund, but for the message our choices sent about your value in this family. You deserved better. The words I had never expected to hear, a clear, unqualified acknowledgement without defensive qualification or emotional manipulation, settled into the space between us with surprising weight. Not a magic resolution, not an instant healing, of decades of accumulated hurt, but a genuine starting point for something different. I accepted her hand, feeling the complex mixture of emotions that accompanies any significant transition. Relief at being finally seen and heard. Caution born from years of having legitimate concerns minimized, hope that this moment of clarity might sustain beyond the immediate crisis, and a curious sense of liberation from patterns that had constrained our relationships for as long as I could remember. Thank you, I said, the simple words carrying layers of meaning. This is where we start rebuilding. The formal aspects of addressing my trust fund situation proceeded with surprising efficiency. Within a week, my mother had signed the paperwork, resigning as trustee, and my father had worked with the bank to establish a structured repayment plan spanning 5 years. The agreement included modest interest to compensate for lost growth and was secured by their investment portfolio as collateral, a provision Marcus had strongly recommended given the magnitude of the misappropriation. What proved more complex was navigating the shifting family dynamics that followed our confrontation. I had maintained minimal contact with my parents during the week of legal and financial arrangements, our interactions limited to necessary updates about paperwork and signatures. I had not spoken to Vanessa at all since our heated exchange in my kitchen, though my phone contained multiple missed calls and increasingly urgent text messages from her. I was reviewing the final trust transfer documents in my home office when my doorbell rang on a Saturday afternoon. When I opened the door, Vanessa stood on my threshold looking uncharacteristically subdued. Gone was the defensive posture and accusatory expression from our last encounter. Instead, she appeared hesitant, almost uncertain, emotions I rarely associated with my confident, assertive sister. "Can we talk?" she asked simply. I hesitated, weighing my emotional capacity for another potentially draining confrontation against the knowledge that any meaningful family reconstruction would eventually require addressing my relationship with Vanessa. After a moment, I stepped back, gesturing her inside. "Thank you," she said, following me to the living room. She declined my perfunctory offer of tea or coffee, sitting on the edge of my sofa with uncharacteristic rigidity. "Mom and Dad told me about the trust fund investigation," she began once we were seated. "About all of it. Not just the wedding expenses, but the years of withdrawals, the total amount." She trailed off, seeming genuinely at a loss for words. I remained silent, giving her space to find her way through what was clearly a difficult conversation for her. I didn't know, she continued finally. I mean, I knew they helped me with expenses sometimes, the down payment on my condo, the semester abroad for Mia, but I never realized where the money was coming from. I never thought to ask. This admission of obliviousness struck me as simultaneously believable and problematic. Vanessa had never been particularly attentive to financial details, content to accept assistance without questioning its source or sustainability. But that very lack of curiosity had enabled the pattern of diverting resources away from me and toward her, a pattern she had benefited from whether or not she had consciously participated in establishing it. Did you ever wonder? I asked, careful to keep my tone neutral rather than accusatory. Our parents have been semi-retired for 3 years. Dad does occasional consulting, but they're primarily living on investment income. Did you ever question how they managed to provide tens of thousands of dollars for discretionary expenses like your wedding upgrades? She flushed slightly, her gaze dropping to her clasped hands. I guess I assumed they had savings, investments. I didn't really think about the specifics. They always said not to worry about it, that they had it covered. They had it covered because they were using money that wasn't theirs to use, I said, still maintaining that careful neutrality. Money that was specifically designated for my future. Vanessa nodded, genuine distress evident in her expression. I know. And I'm so sorry, Alexandra. If I had understood where the money was coming from, I never would have accepted it. Especially not for something like wedding upgrades or Mia's semester in Florence. I studied her face, searching for the defensiveness or deflection that had characterized our previous conversation. Instead, I found what appeared to be genuine remorse. A recognition not just of the financial impropriety, but of her unwitting role in perpetuating a pattern that had consistently disadvantaged me. Dad says they're selling the Vermont property to help repay the trust, she continued when I didn't immediately respond. I told them I want to contribute too. I can't repay everything they spent on me over the years, not immediately anyway, but I can take responsibility for the wedding expenses at least. The offer took me by surprise. Vanessa had never been financially irresponsible in the conventional sense. She maintained good credit, paid her bills on time, lived within her means as a successful pharmaceutical sales representative. But she had also never been one to voluntarily forgo opportunities or experiences due to financial constraints, particularly when our parents were willing to bridge any gaps between her income and her desires. You don't have to do that, I said, more from habit than conviction. The repayment agreement is between Mom, Dad, and the trust. But I benefited from money that should have been yours, she insisted with uncharacteristic firmness. Maybe I didn't know where it was coming from, but that doesn't change the fact that my wedding was partially financed by your inheritance. I want to make that right. Her willingness to accept personal responsibility rather than deflecting it back to our parents represented a significant shift. One that suggested she might be more capable of genuine reflection than our previous interactions had indicated. Thank you, I said simply. I appreciate that. We sat in silence for a moment, the air between us heavy with unspoken history and tentative possibility. Then Vanessa leaned forward, her expression more serious than I could remember seeing it in years. Can I ask you something? And will you promise to be completely honest, even if it's hard to hear? I nodded, curious despite my lingering wariness. Has it always been like this? She asked, her voice quieter now. Have Mom and Dad always prioritized me over you? Because when they tried to explain what happened with the trust, they mentioned a pattern they hadn't fully recognized until you pointed it out. And it made me wonder if I've been missing something obvious all these years. The question was breathtakingly direct, free from the defensiveness that had characterized our previous attempts to discuss family dynamics. It opened a door I had never expected Vanessa herself to unlock, an opportunity for genuine conversation about patterns we had both participated in but never explicitly acknowledged. Yes, I said simply. For as long as I can remember, there's been a clear pattern of prioritizing your needs and wants over mine. When resources were limited, mine were the first sacrificed. When attention was divided, your needs took precedence. When plans changed, I was the one expected to adjust without complaint. I paused, gauging her reaction before continuing. To my surprise, instead of bristling with defense or denial, she nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. I think I knew on some level, she admitted. Not in a way I could articulate, but I always had this sense that things came more easily, to me, within our family. That my requests received immediate attention while yours were subject to more scrutiny and qualification. I guess I assumed that was because you needed less, that you were more independent by nature rather than by necessity. The insight that she had registered the disparity in treatment without fully processing its implications struck me as a significant breakthrough. Not complete understanding, certainly not immediate transformation of lifelong patterns, but a genuine recognition that might serve as foundation for something new. I became independent because I had to, I explained, echoing what I had told our parents. Because I learned early that being low maintenance was the only way to receive positive attention in our family. Your needs created crisis and immediate response. My careful planning and independent problem-solving meant I rarely created those crisis moments that mobilized family resources. Vanessa was quiet for a long moment, absorbing this perspective that so fundamentally challenged her understanding of our shared history. When she finally spoke, her voice was subdued but steady. I never saw it that way, she said. I always envied your self-sufficiency, your clarity about what you wanted and how to achieve it. I thought those qualities came naturally to you, that you were just born more focused and disciplined than I was. I never considered that you might have developed them out of necessity, because you couldn't count on the same support I received automatically. The admission, honest, unqualified, free from defensive posturing, created an opening for a kind of conversation we had never had before. Not a complete resolution, not an instant healing of accumulated hurt, but a genuine starting point for a different kind of relationship. I think we both adapted to the dynamics our parents established, I offered. You learned that expressing needs openly would mobilize resources and attention. I learned that self-sufficiency and minimal demands were the path to approval, if not equal support. She nodded slowly, visibly processing this reframing of our roles within the family system. And then those adaptations became self-reinforcing. The more I relied on Mom and Dad's intervention, the more they provided it. The more independent you became, the more they assumed you didn't need their support. Exactly, I confirmed, struck by her quick grasp of the pattern once it had been explicitly named. It became a feedback loop that none of us recognized or questioned, until the trust fund investigation forced it into the open. Vanessa's expression shifted from reflective to determined. I want to break that pattern, she said with surprising conviction. Not just because of what happened with your trust fund, but because it's limited both of us in different ways. You've had to be excessively self-reliant, carrying burdens alone that should have been shared. And I've been prevented from developing the independence and problem-solving skills that come from facing consequences and finding my own solutions. The insight that the pattern had constrained her development as much as it had burdened mine, albeit in different ways, suggested a depth of self-awareness I hadn't previously credited her with. It also offered a foundation for addressing our relationship that wasn't rooted solely in grievance or guilt, but in mutual interest in establishing healthier dynamics. I'd like that too, I said cautiously. But changing patterns established over decades takes more than good intentions. It requires consistent awareness and effort, especially when the habits are so deeply ingrained they feel natural. I know, she acknowledged. and I'm not expecting overnight transformation. But I am committing to being more conscious of these dynamics, to stopping myself when I fall into old patterns of expectation or entitlement, to recognizing when I'm asking more of you than I'm willing to give in return. The commitment, specific, actionable, focused on her own behavior rather than external circumstances, felt qualitatively different from the vague reassurances or defensive deflections that had characterized previous attempts to address inequities in our relationship. "Thank you," I said simply. "That means a lot." In the weeks that followed my conversations with my parents and Vanessa, a subtle but significant shift began to emerge in our family dynamics. The changes weren't dramatic or immediate. Lifelong patterns don't transform overnight. But there was a new awareness, a conscious effort to examine interactions that had previously passed without question. My father, true to his word, had not only arranged for my mother's resignation as trustee, but had also taken the lead in establishing the repayment plan. He approached the process with the same meticulous attention he had once devoted to his corporate legal work, creating a structured schedule that accounted for their current financial reality, while prioritizing the restoration of my trust. The Vermont property, which had been in my father's family for 3 generations, was listed for sale. A tangible demonstration of their commitment to making amends that carried emotional significance beyond its financial value. When I expressed concern about this during a carefully neutral phone call, my father's response surprised me. "The property matters, Alexandra," he acknowledged, "but not more than addressing what happened with your trust. Not more than demonstrating that we recognize the seriousness of our actions and are committed to making things right." This prioritization, choosing to address a wrong done to me even at significant personal cost, represented a fundamental shift in how my needs and interests were positioned within family decisions. For perhaps the first time in our relationship, my father was explicitly placing my financial security above considerations that would previously have taken precedence automatically. Vanessa, meanwhile, had begun making monthly contributions toward repaying the wedding expenses, modest amounts that represented a genuine stretch for her budget, but demonstrated consistent commitment to her stated intention. More significant than the financial contribution, however, was the shift in how she engaged with me. Our communications, previously dominated by her needs and concerns with minimal inquiry about my life, had become more balanced. She began asking thoughtful questions about my work and interests, listening attentively to my responses rather than waiting for an opening to redirect the conversation to herself. When she did share challenges or requests, they came with explicit acknowledgement of reciprocity, recognition that relationship involves mutual support rather than one-sided accommodation. These changes, while promising, existed alongside the natural caution that follows significant breach of trust. I maintained a certain emotional distance as I observed these efforts, unwilling to rush back into unqualified closeness before consistent actions had demonstrated that the shifts were sustainable rather than temporary adjustments made under pressure. Marcus Delaney and the bank's trust department provided unexpected support during this transitional period. With my mother no longer serving as trustee, they had assumed management of the remaining trust assets and oversight of the repayment process. Their involvement created a formal structure that removed much of the potential emotional complexity from financial discussions. Regular statements documented the progress of repayments. Professional management ensured appropriate growth of the remaining assets, and any questions or concerns could be addressed through official channels rather than potentially fraught family conversations. This professional framework allowed my relationship with my parents and sister to develop separately from the financial remediation, reducing the risk that emotional reconnection would be conflated with or contingent upon financial resolution. The trust department's involvement ensured accountability without requiring me to personally monitor or enforce the repayment agreement, creating space for healing that wasn't burdened by ongoing financial vigilance. As spring turned to early summer, another unexpected development emerged. My grandfather's older sister, Great-Aunt Margaret, reached out to arrange a lunch meeting at her retirement community on the outskirts of the city. Now, in her late 80s, Margaret Reynolds had always been a somewhat peripheral figure in our family gatherings, present at major holidays and celebrations but rarely involved in day-to-day interactions. I had always sensed a certain tension between her and my mother, though as a child and even as a young adult, I had never understood its source. The retirement community's dining room was elegant but comfortable, with linen tablecloths and fresh flowers creating an atmosphere of refined simplicity. Great-Aunt Margaret, despite her advanced age, remained sharp and articulate, her posture erect and her gaze direct as we exchanged initial pleasantries. "I hear there's been quite a situation with your trust fund," she said once our orders had been taken, dispensing with small talk with characteristic directness. Caroline stepping down as trustee, Richard arranging repayments, even listing the Vermont property. I shouldn't have been surprised that she knew. Family news travels through established channels regardless of whether the primary parties are actively communicating, but the extent of her information caught me off guard. "Yes," I confirmed. Simply. There were some irregularities in how the trust was managed. Margaret's expression suggested she found my diplomatic phrasing amusing. "Irregularities," she repeated. "Is that what we're calling it when a trustee systematically diverts funds from their intended purpose over a period of years?" Her bluntness was startling, but also oddly refreshing after weeks of careful conversations filled with emotional nuance and qualification. "That's a more accurate description," I acknowledged. "How did you hear about it?" "Your father called me about the Vermont property," she explained. "He needed my signature on some paperwork. There's a partial interest that passed to me when your grandfather died." During that conversation, he explained why they were selling. I must say it was the most honest discussion Richard and I have had in decades. This revelation, that my father had voluntarily disclosed the mismanagement of my trust rather than creating a more flattering explanation for the property sale, indicated a level of accountability I hadn't fully credited him with. It would have been easy to construct a narrative about retirement planning or downsizing that concealed the actual reason for liquidating a family asset, particularly when communicating with an elder relation who had no direct knowledge of the situation. "I'm glad he was honest with you," I said simply. Margaret studied me with keen eyes that belied her years. "You know, Alexandra, what happened with your trust isn't entirely surprising to me. I saw similar patterns with your grandfather and your father." I leaned forward, curious despite my usual caution about family discussions. "What do you mean?" "Edward, your grandfather, always favored Richard over his younger brother, Thomas. It wasn't obvious in obvious ways. Edward was too careful for that. But the pattern was clear to anyone paying attention. Richard received more educational support, more career guidance, more financial backing for his early ventures. Thomas was expected to make his own way, to be self-sufficient while Richard received ongoing assistance. The parallel to my own experience was striking. Another generation of the same pattern, with one child receiving disproportionate resources and attention, while the other was expected to demonstrate greater independence and resilience. "I didn't know that," I said. "Dad never mentioned any inequity in how grandfather treated him and Uncle Thomas." Margaret's smile held a certain wryness. "Of course he didn't. The beneficiaries of such patterns rarely recognize them, while those disadvantaged by them are acutely aware, but often silent out of a combination of pride and resignation." She paused, taking a sip of her water before continuing. "When Edward established trusts for you and Vanessa, I wondered if he was trying to correct the pattern he had perpetuated with his own children, ensuring equal financial support for his granddaughters, regardless of your parents' predispositions. But it seems Caroline and Richard found a way to reintroduce the imbalance despite his intentions." The observation added another dimension to my understanding of our family dynamics, suggesting that the patterns I had experienced weren't isolated to my immediate family, but represented the continuation of multi-generational tendencies that had shaped relationships long before I was born. "Did you ever discuss this with grandfather?" I asked. "The difference in how he treated Dad and Uncle." "Thomas?" "Once," she acknowledged. "Near the end of his life, when he was establishing your trusts. I suggested that perhaps Thomas's children should receive additional consideration, given the historical imbalance in support." Edward dismissed the idea, said both his sons had turned out well, that different children simply need different types of support. She shook her head slightly, the gesture conveying decades-old frustration. "It's a convenient justification, isn't it? That unequal distribution of resources and attention is simply responding to different needs rather than reflecting preferential treatment. It allows the pattern to continue without acknowledgement or correction." The insight resonated deeply. With my own experience, the way my parents had justified their prioritization of Vanessa's needs and wants as appropriate response to our different personalities and circumstances, rather than recognizing it as fundamentally inequitable treatment. "Is that why you wanted to meet with me?" I asked. "To share this history?" Margaret's expression softened slightly. "Partly. I thought understanding the multi-generational nature of these patterns might help you contextualize your experience. See? That it reflects long-standing family dynamics rather than something specific to you or your worth." She paused, her gaze direct and clear. "But I also wanted to tell you how impressed I am by your response to the situation. Standing firm in your right to have the trust managed properly, insisting on formal remediation rather than accepting vague promises, requiring explicit acknowledgement of the patterns that allowed the misappropriation to occur. These demonstrate remarkable clarity and strength. The validation, coming from someone with historical perspective on our family dynamics, but no direct stake in maintaining their continuance, carried surprising weight. It affirmed that my response wasn't disproportionate or unnecessarily adversarial, as my mother had initially suggested, but represented appropriate boundary setting in the face of significant breach of trust. "Thank you," I said simply. "That means a lot, especially given your perspective on our family history." Margaret nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You've done something important, Alexandra, not just for yourself, but potentially for future generations of this family. By naming patterns that have operated unchallenged for decades, by requiring accountability rather than accepting minimization or justification, you've created an opening for genuine change. Whether that opening leads to transformation depends on many factors beyond your control, but creating the possibility is significant in itself." Her words crystallized something I had felt but not fully articulated, that addressing the trust fund mismanagement wasn't just about recovering financial resources that should have been protected for my future, but about challenging patterns that had constrained family relationships for generations. By refusing to participate in dynamics that positioned some family members' needs and interests as inherently more important than others, I had potentially disrupted a cycle that might otherwise have continued unchallenged into the next generation. "I hope you're right," I said. "About the possibility for change, I mean. There have been some promising shifts in how we're interacting, but I'm cautious about assuming they'll be sustained once the immediate crisis has passed." As my 30th birthday approached in early July, I found myself at an unexpected crossroads. According to the original terms of my grandfather's trust, this milestone would grant me full access to the assets he had set aside for my future. In the alternate reality, where no misappropriation had occurred, I would have been preparing to utilize these funds for the down payment on a home, a modest but well-located property in a neighborhood with good schools and a reasonable commute to my office at the public health nonprofit. Instead, I was navigating a complex new landscape where my inheritance existed partially on paper and partially in the form of a structured repayment agreement. The remaining balance in the trust, approximately $278,000, would become available to me. but the larger portion was now documented in a formal arrangement that would restore the misappropriated funds over the next 5 years. 2 weeks before my birthday, Marcus Delaney requested a meeting to discuss the transition. The Trust Department conference room had become familiar territory over the preceding months, its neutral professionalism providing a container for financial discussions that might otherwise have been fraught with emotional complexity. "As you know, Ms. Reynolds," Marcus began, "your 30th birthday triggers the full distribution provision in your grandfather's trust. You'll have complete access to the remaining balance and all future repayments as they're received." He slid a folder across the table containing documents outlining the current status of the trust, the repayment schedule, and the various options for managing the assets moving forward. "You have several choices to consider," he continued. "You can take immediate distribution of the remaining balance, maintaining the repayment schedule as established. You can leave some or all of the assets under the bank's management in investment vehicles of your choosing. Or you can establish a new trust structure with specific parameters for how the funds, both current and future repayments, will be utilized." I reviewed the documents carefully, noting the detailed projections for how the repayments would gradually restore the trust to its intended value, albeit years later than my grandfather had planned. The Vermont property was now under contract, with closing scheduled for the following month. That sale would provide a significant initial repayment, with monthly contributions from my parents and Vanessa supplementing it over the 5-year term. "What would you recommend?" I asked, valuing Marcus's professional perspective as I contemplated these options. He considered the question thoughtfully before responding. "From a purely financial standpoint, maintaining some professional management would be advantageous, especially for the repayment funds as they come in. It provides discipline and structure that can be difficult to maintain individually, particularly with funds arriving in irregular amounts and intervals." He paused, then added, "That said, your grandfather established this trust specifically to give you financial autonomy at this stage of your life. There's value in honoring that intention, in making your own decisions about these resources now that you've reached the milestone he designated." The observation resonated beyond its financial implications. My grandfather had created the trust to provide me with options and independence at 30, the ability to establish foundations for my adult life without being constrained by immediate financial limitations. The misappropriation had temporarily compromised that intention, but the remediation process had created an opportunity to reclaim it, albeit in a form he couldn't have anticipated. "I think I'd like to take a hybrid approach," I said after careful consideration. "I'll withdraw enough for a modest down payment on a home, smaller than I'd originally planned, but still a start, and leave the remainder under management to receive the repayments and generate returns." Marcus nodded approval. "That strikes a good balance between immediate utilization and long-term growth. We can structure the managed portion to provide regular income if you need it, or to emphasize growth if your current salary meets your needs adequately." We spent the next hour detailing the specifics: how much would be withdrawn immediately, how the managed portion would be invested, how repayments would be documented and allocated. Throughout the discussion, I was struck by how different this felt from my previous relationship to these financial resources. Before the trust fund investigation, I had been a passive beneficiary, waiting for access to funds that were being managed and, as it turned out, mismanaged by others. Now I was an active participant in determining how these resources would be structured and utilized, making informed choices based on clear information and professional guidance. This shift, from passive recipient to active decision-maker, extended beyond the financial realm. In the 3 months since confronting my parents about the misappropriation, I had moved from unconscious participation in established family dynamics to conscious evaluation of which patterns I wanted to maintain and which I needed to modify or reject entirely. As I left the bank that afternoon, I found myself reflecting on this transformation. The trust fund investigation had begun as a response to financial irregularity, but it had evolved into something far more significant: catalyst for examining and restructuring relationships that had been constrained by unacknowledged patterns for decades. My phone buzzed with a text from Vanessa as I walked to my car. "Lunch tomorrow. I want to talk to you about something important. My treat." The invitation itself reflected the subtle shift in our relationship. Previously, Vanessa's communications had typically taken the form of requests or announcements rather than invitations, and the explicit offer to pay represented recognition of the financial imbalance she was working to address. I confirmed the time and place, curious about what she considered important enough to warrant a specific discussion. We had maintained regular contact over the preceding months, but our interactions had been characterized by careful rebuilding of trust rather than deep personal sharing. The following day, I arrived at the cafe Vanessa had suggested, a quiet place known for its healthy lunch options rather than the trendy hotspots she typically preferred. She was already seated at a corner table, 2 glasses of water and a basket of multi-grain bread arranged between the place settings. "Thanks for meeting me," she said as I sat down. "I know you're busy with all the trust transition details." The acknowledgement of my priorities, simple but significant in its recognition that my time and attention were valuable, was another small indicator of shifting patterns. "It's fine," I assured her. "Actually, the timing is good. I just met with Marcus yesterday to finalize the distribution plan." "That's part of what I wanted to talk about," she said, her expression more serious than usual. "With your birthday coming up and the trust becoming accessible, I've been thinking a lot about fairness and equity in our family." The directness of her approach surprised me. Vanessa had typically avoided explicit discussions of family dynamics, preferring to operate within established patterns rather than examining them critically. "I want to make a more substantial contribution toward repaying what was taken from your trust," she continued before I could respond. "Not just the wedding expenses, but a portion of the other withdrawals as well." I frowned slightly, confused by this extension of responsibility. "Vanessa, the repayment agreement is with Mom and Dad. They're the ones who made the withdrawals, who had legal obligation as trustees." "I know," she acknowledged, "but I benefited from decisions they made, even if I wasn't directly involved in making them. The semester abroad for Mia, the down payment assistance for my condo, the extended family vacation after Dad's heart episode, those all came from your trust, and they all benefited me directly or indirectly." Her willingness to accept this broader sense of responsibility, to recognize that benefiting from inequity creates obligation even without direct participation in creating it, indicated a depth of reflection I hadn't previously credited her with. "I appreciate that," I said carefully. "But financially, you're already contributing to the wedding expenses, and that's a significant commitment given your budget." "This isn't just about money," she said, leaning forward slightly. "Or rather, it's about money as a representation of something deeper. I've been thinking about what Aunt Margaret said to you about the multi-generational patterns in our family. How grandfather favored Dad over Uncle Thomas, how Mom and Dad continued that pattern with us." I blinked in surprise. "You spoke with Aunt Margaret?" "I called her after you mentioned your lunch," Vanessa explained. "I wanted to understand more about what she'd observed in our family history. The parallels between Dad's experience as the favored son and mine as the favored daughter are uncomfortable to acknowledge, but important to understand if I want to break the pattern." This proactive step, reaching out independently to gain perspective on family dynamics rather than waiting for others to manage the emotional work of relationship maintenance, represented significant growth from the Vanessa who had appeared at my door months earlier, demanding explanation for actions she deemed inexplicable. "What did she tell you?" I asked, genuinely curious about how Margaret had framed these patterns to Vanessa. "She was brutally honest," Vanessa said with a rueful smile. "Told me she had watched me grow up receiving the same preferential treatment Dad had received from grandfather, and that I had demonstrated the same obliviousness to it that he had. Said she wasn't surprised I hadn't questioned where the money for my wedding or Mia's semester abroad was coming from, because I had been raised to expect my needs and wants would always be met regardless of constraints that might apply to others. The assessment was direct to the point of harshness, but also fundamentally accurate. Margaret had apparently recognized no need to soften her observations for Vanessa, trusting that truth was more valuable than comfort in addressing long-standing patterns. "That must have been difficult to hear," I said, acknowledging the emotional impact such direct confrontation would necessarily carry. "It was," Vanessa admitted, "but it was also clarifying. It helped me understand why contributing to the financial repayment matters beyond the monetary value, because it represents taking responsibility for my role in a pattern that has caused real harm, even if that role was primarily passive acceptance rather than active perpetuation." This framing, that addressing financial inequity was part of addressing broader relational patterns, demonstrated an understanding of how material resources and emotional dynamics are interconnected, how the flow of money often reflects and reinforces the flow of care, attention, and priority within family systems. "Thank you," I said simply, "for being willing to see these patterns and to take active steps to address them. That means more than the financial contribution itself." Vanessa nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about Mia too, about what messages she's absorbing from how our family operates. I don't want her growing up with the same sense of entitlement I developed, the expectation that her needs will always take precedence regardless of impact on others. This extension of awareness to the next generation, recognition that patterns established now would shape not just our relationship, but her daughter's understanding of family dynamics, suggested a depth of reflection that transcended immediate concerns about the trust fund or even our current relationship. "What are you thinking in terms of contribution?" I asked, returning to the practical aspects of her proposal. My 30th birthday arrived on a perfect summer morning, sunlight streaming through my bedroom window with the promise of warmth and clarity. In many ways, this milestone felt more significant than I had anticipated when I'd marked it on my calendar months earlier. It represented not just another year of life, but a fundamental transition in how I related to my family, my finances, and my own sense of worth within larger systems. Following my meeting with Marcus and subsequent lunch, with Vanessa, I had finalized the distribution plan for my trust. I would withdraw $200,000 for a modest down payment on a home, leaving the remaining $78,000 under management to receive the ongoing repayments and generate returns. The arrangement balanced my immediate needs with prudent planning for future security, a compromise that honored my grandfather's intentions while accommodating the realities created by years of misappropriation. I had deliberately kept my birthday plans simple, a small gathering of close friends for dinner at my favorite restaurant, rather than the elaborate celebration Vanessa might have arranged or the family-focused event my mother would have preferred. I needed space to mark this transition on my own terms, to celebrate personal growth and newfound clarity, without the emotional complexity of family dynamics dominating the occasion. My phone chimed with messages throughout the morning, warm wishes from colleagues, thoughtful notes from friends, a characteristically concise text from my father, and an elaborate multi-paragraph message from my mother expressing both celebration and thinly veiled disappointment about not being included in my evening plans. Vanessa had sent a simple but sincere message the night before, respecting my request for a quiet morning without calls or visits. As I prepared for my day, allowing myself the luxury of a late start before heading to the office for a half day of work, another message arrived, this one from an unfamiliar number with a local area code. "Alexandra, this is Thomas Reynolds, your father's brother. I'm in town unexpectedly and would very much like to meet with you today if possible. I have something that belongs to you. Please call when convenient." I stared at the message with mingled curiosity and caution. Uncle Thomas had been a peripheral figure in my life, present at major family events, but seldom actively involved in our regular interactions. He lived on the West Coast, managing investments and teaching economics at a small liberal arts college, and his visits east were infrequent and typically brief. I had always sensed a certain tension between him and my father, though as a child, I had attributed it to their different personalities and life choices rather than to any specific conflict. After Great-Aunt Margaret's revelations about the multi-generational patterns in our family, my grandfather's favoritism toward my father over Thomas, mirroring the preferential treatment Vanessa had received over me, my uncle's distance took on new significance. Had he, like me, eventually established boundaries to protect himself from dynamics that consistently disadvantaged him? Had he, too, reached a point where limitation rather than expansion of family engagement seemed the healthiest choice? Intrigued by both the unexpected contact and the mysterious reference to something that belonged to me, I called the number. Thomas answered immediately, his voice familiar despite the infrequency of our interactions. "Alexandra, thank you for calling back so quickly, and happy birthday." "Thank you, Uncle Thomas. Your message mentioned you're in town?" "Yes, just for the day. I'm here for a conference at the university, flying back to Portland tomorrow morning. I was hoping we might meet for coffee this afternoon, perhaps around 3 at the West Side Cafe." The location he suggested was near my office, a quiet, independently owned coffee shop known for its comfortable atmosphere and privacy. I agreed to the meeting, curiosity overcoming any residual caution about engaging with family on my birthday. When I arrived at the cafe shortly before 3, Thomas was already seated at a corner table, a slim leather portfolio and 2 small gift bags arranged before him. At 62, he remained fit and vigorous, his silver hair and beard neatly trimmed, his attire casually professional in a way that bridged his academic and investment careers. "Alexandra," he said warmly, standing to greet me with a brief embrace. "Thank you for making time on your birthday. You look well. There's a clarity about you that suits you." The observation was perceptive and slightly unexpected. Thomas and I had never had the kind of relationship where personal observations were commonly exchanged, our interactions typically limited to polite inquiries about work and general well-being during family gatherings. "Thank you," I replied, settling into the chair across from him. "It's been an eventful few months, with some significant realizations and changes." "So I've heard," he said, his expression thoughtful rather than judgmental. "Margaret called me after your lunch together. She thought I might have perspective to offer given certain parallels in our family history." I nodded, unsurprised that Margaret had reached out to him. Her commitment to addressing long-standing family patterns seemed to extend beyond her conversations with me and Vanessa, to include the previous generation as well. "She mentioned that grandfather favored Dad over you," I acknowledged directly, seeing no benefit in pretending ignorance of dynamics that had clearly shaped our family for decades, similar to how my parents prioritized Vanessa over me. Thomas's eyebrows rose slightly at my directness, but his expression suggested appreciation rather than discomfort. "Yes, that's an accurate assessment. Edward, your grandfather, was not malicious or deliberately cruel, but he did demonstrate consistent preferential treatment toward Richard throughout our lives. Financial support, attention to achievements, benefit of the doubt during challenges, all flowed more readily to my brother than to me." The parallels to my own experience were striking despite the generational gap and different family positions. Different specific instances, different historical contexts, but the same fundamental pattern of unequal distribution of resources and regard. "Did you ever confront him about it?" I asked, curious about how he had navigated dynamics so similar to those I was currently addressing. "Once, in my early 30s, he said with a slight smile. "About your age now, actually. After years of watching the pattern play out without acknowledgement, I finally reached a point where I needed to name it directly. The response was not particularly satisfying." "In what way?" Edward acknowledged the difference in treatment, but justified it as appropriate response to our different personalities and needs. Richard was more sensitive, required more guidance, benefited from more active support. I was more independent, better suited to finding my own path, more resilient in the face of challenge. The explanation was so eerily similar to how my parents had justified their prioritization of Vanessa's needs over mine that it sent a chill through me despite the cafe's warmth. The same framing, different children requiring different supports, rather than preferential treatment reflecting unconscious favoritism, had apparently served as justification across generations. "That sounds familiar," I said simply. Thomas nodded understanding. "I imagine it does. The remarkable thing about these family patterns is how they replicate themselves with such precision despite the passage of time and change of specific circumstances. Different individuals, different era, same fundamental dynamic. The golden child and the self-sufficient one, each locked into roles that limit authentic development and relationship. The framing, that both positions within the dynamic were ultimately constraining, albeit in different ways, echoed what Vanessa had expressed during our recent lunch. It suggested that addressing these patterns wasn't just about remedying the disadvantages experienced by those in the self-sufficient role, but about liberating all family members from constraints that limited genuine growth and connection. "What happened after you confronted grandfather?" I asked, curious about the long-term impact of his attempt to address the pattern directly. "Not much changed in his behavior," Thomas admitted. He continued to favor Richard, though perhaps with slightly more awareness or occasional attempts at correction. But something important changed in me. I stopped expecting equal treatment, stopped hoping for recognition or support that was unlikely to materialize, stopped measuring my worth by his assessment or investment. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze direct and clear. "I built my life according to my own values and priorities, rather than in reaction to or anticipation of his approval." That shift, from orientation around his perception to centering of my own authentic choices, was profoundly liberating. This perspective, that freedom came not necessarily from changing others' behavior, but from changing one's relationship to and expectations of that behavior, offered a pathway forward that didn't depend on complete transformation of long-standing family patterns. It suggested that genuine autonomy emerged from internal shifts in how one related to established dynamics, not just from external changes in how those dynamics operated. "That's what I'm working toward," I acknowledged. "Not just financial restoration, through the repayment plan, but a fundamental recalibration of how I engage with family patterns, what I expect, what I accept, what I require as conditions for continued relationship." Thomas nodded approval. "That's the real work, and from what Margaret has shared about how you've handled the trust fund situation, you're well on your way." He paused, then reached for the leather portfolio on the table between us. "Which brings me to the purpose of our meeting today." He opened the portfolio to reveal a set of documents, the top page bearing a formal letterhead, and my grandfather's distinctive signature at the bottom. "When Edward established the trusts for you and Vanessa, he also created a separate instrument, a supplemental fund that would become accessible to each of you on your 30th birthdays, provided certain conditions were met." I frowned in confusion. "I've never heard of any supplemental fund. The trust Marcus oversees is the only inheritance I'm aware of." "That's by design," Thomas explained. "Edward designated me as administrator of this supplemental arrangement, precisely because he wanted it managed separately from the primary trusts, with different parameters and oversight." He turned the document toward me, allowing me to read the formal legal language that established this previously unknown financial instrument. The structure was similar to my primary trust, but with key differences. Most notably, the conditions for distribution and the designation of Thomas rather than my parents as administrator. The supplemental fund was established with $100,000 for each of you, he continued as I reviewed the document. It was to be conservatively invested and allowed to grow until your 30th birthdays, at which point it would become accessible provided you had demonstrated financial responsibility and independence during early adulthood. I looked up from the document, startled by this revelation. And who determined whether those conditions were met? I did, as administrator, Thomas confirmed. Edward trusted my judgment in assessing genuine financial maturity as distinct from simple adherence to others' expectations or directions. The arrangement, a secondary inheritance contingent on demonstration of specific qualities, administered by the family member who had himself experienced inequitable treatment, suggested a level of strategic planning I hadn't previously attributed to my grandfather. Had he anticipated the potential for mismanagement of the primary trusts? Had he recognized the family patterns clearly enough to establish this additional layer of security? What about Vanessa? I asked, processing the implications of this new information. Did she receive her supplemental fund when she turned 33 years ago? No, Thomas said simply. While Vanessa has many admirable qualities, at 30 she had not demonstrated the financial independence and responsibility required by the terms of the instrument. She had maintained consistent employment, but had also established patterns of spending beyond her means and relying on parental intervention to address financial challenges. I sat back in my chair, processing the implications of what Thomas had just shared. Not only had my grandfather established a supplemental fund I'd never known about, but he had also created specific conditions that recognized and rewarded the very qualities I had developed, often out of necessity rather than choice. So the supplemental fund still exists? I asked, trying to understand the full picture. For both Vanessa and me? Thomas nodded, reaching for one of the small gift bags on the table. Yes, though with different current values due to the timing of potential distribution. Vanessa's portion continues to grow until she meets the established criteria or reaches the age of 40, at which point I have discretion to distribute partial amounts based on demonstrated progress. He handed me the gift bag with a small smile. This contains the formal notification of your qualification under the terms of the supplemental fund, along with the current valuation and options for distribution or continued management. I opened the bag to find an elegant envelope containing formal documents on heavy cream stationery. The top page stated simply, "Having met all conditions established by Edward Reynolds, Alexandra Reynolds is hereby granted full access to supplemental Fund A, current value $267,482, effective July 15th, 2025. The figure momentarily took my breath away. Combined with the remaining balance in my primary trust and the ongoing repayments, this supplemental fund would essentially restore my financial position to what it would have been without the years of misappropriation, and it would do so immediately, rather than over the 5-year repayment period. I don't know what to say, I admitted, looking up from the document. This is entirely unexpected. Edward was a complex man, Thomas said, his expression thoughtful. Capable of perpetuating harmful patterns in his relationships with his own children while simultaneously attempting to establish safeguards for his grandchildren. I've often wondered if he recognized the dynamics he created between Richard and me more clearly in retrospect than he could in the moment. If establishing this supplemental arrangement was his attempt to ensure those patterns wouldn't disadvantage you in the same way they did me. The possibility that my grandfather had possessed this level of self-awareness, that he had recognized the potential for the same damaging patterns to continue into the next generation, and had taken concrete steps to mitigate their impact, added a new dimension to my understanding of our family history. It suggested that recognition of problematic dynamics didn't necessarily translate to immediate correction of one's own behavior, but could still inform efforts to protect future generations from their consequences. The timing of this is remarkable, I observed. Just as I've been working to address the misappropriation from my primary trust, this supplemental fund becomes available and essentially resolves the financial impact of that mismanagement. Thomas smiled slightly. The timing is not entirely coincidental. While I've been aware of your qualification for some time, Margaret's recent communications about the situation with your primary trust accelerated my decision to meet with you directly. The supplemental fund was always intended as a safety net, a resource that would become available when genuinely needed rather than automatically dispensed at a predetermined age. His explanation confirmed my growing sense that this arrangement reflected my grandfather's attempt to establish protections that transcended the family patterns he himself had participated in creating. He hadn't been able to fully extract himself from those dynamics in his relationship with his sons, but he had created mechanisms that might shield his granddaughters from their worst effects. "What about the second gift bag?" I asked, noticing that Thomas had not yet explained its presence. "Ah," he said, his expression warming. "That contains something more personal." He pushed it gently across the table. "A birthday gift, separate from the financial arrangements." I opened the second bag to find a small wooden box, its lid inlaid with a delicate pattern of maple and walnut. Inside, nestled on a bed of blue velvet, was a vintage fountain pen, an elegant instrument with a deep blue barrel and gold accents. "It was Edward's," Thomas explained as I lifted it carefully from the box. "His favorite writing instrument during the years when he was building the business that ultimately generated the resources now in your trusts. He used it to sign the original documents establishing both the primary and supplemental funds for you and Vanessa." The pen represented a tangible connection to the grandfather I had known and loved, but whose complex legacy I was only now beginning to fully understand. It symbolized both his business acumen, the careful planning and execution that had created financial security for future generations, and his personal values, including the foresight to establish protections against patterns he recognized but couldn't entirely transcend. "Thank you," I said simply, the words inadequate to the significance of both gifts. The financial security represented by the supplemental fund and the personal connection embodied in the pen. "You've earned both," Thomas replied. "The fund, through your demonstrated financial responsibility and independence, and the pen through your courage in addressing patterns that have gone unchallenged for too long in our family." He paused, his expression growing more serious. "I should acknowledge that I haven't always been as present or engaged with you as I might have been. After my confrontation with Edward, I gradually established more distance from family dynamics that consistently disadvantaged me. That was necessary for my own well-being, but it also meant I wasn't as available to you as I perhaps should have been, given the parallels in our experiences." The acknowledgement, honest, direct, free from defensiveness or qualification, carried significant weight. It recognized that his understandable withdrawal from painful family dynamics had unintentionally perpetuated my isolation within those same patterns. "I understand why you created that distance," I assured him, "and I've recently made similar choices about limiting certain engagements to protect my own emotional health." "A necessary step," he agreed, "but not the final one. What I've learned over time is that selective, boundaried engagement can eventually replace complete withdrawal, that it's possible to maintain connection without sacrificing self-protection once you've established clarity about what constitutes acceptable interaction." This perspective, that boundaries weren't just walls to keep others out but frameworks that established conditions for healthy engagement, offered a more nuanced approach than the binary choice between complete accommodation or total disconnection. It suggested the possibility of relationship that honored both personal needs and family bonds, that neither sacrificed self-respect nor abandoned the potential for meaningful connection. "That's my hope," I admitted. "To establish terms of engagement that protect my interests and dignity while allowing for whatever genuine connection is possible within those parameters." Thomas nodded, his expression reflecting both approval and a certain wistfulness. "It's a worthwhile aspiration, and one I've pursued with varying degrees of success over the years," Richard and I have established a functional, if somewhat distant, relationship. We connect around specific shared interests and family obligations, while respecting the limits I've established regarding certain topics and dynamics. This model, limited, but genuine connection based on mutual interests and clear boundaries, provided a template for what might be possible in my own relationships with my parents and sister. Not the unreserved closeness that might have developed in healthier family systems, perhaps, but authentic engagement that neither perpetuated harmful patterns nor foreclosed the possibility of relationship entirely. I'd like to maintain contact with you moving forward, I said, making a decision that felt both significant and natural. Beyond the administration of the supplemental fund, I mean. Your perspective on our family history and dynamics has been invaluable, and I suspect there's much more I could learn from your experience navigating similar patterns. I'd welcome that, he replied with evident sincerity. Perhaps this unexpected situation with the trusts, challenging as it's been, has created an opening for connection that might not otherwise have developed. The observation highlighted an unexpected benefit of the trust fund investigation. Its revelation of long-standing patterns had not only clarified my understanding of current family dynamics, but had also created potential for new relationships with family members like Thomas and Margaret, whose experiences paralleled mine in ways I hadn't previously recognized or understood. As our conversation continued, touching on his academic work, my role at the public health nonprofit, and our shared interest in economic systems that supported genuine social well-being, I found myself experiencing a kind of kinship I had rarely felt within my immediate family. There was an ease to our interaction, a mutual respect and interest that didn't require careful management of emotional undercurrents or wariness about hidden agendas. When we eventually parted, Thomas with a flight to catch early the next morning, and I with dinner plans with friends, he embraced me with genuine warmth. "Happy birthday, Alexandra," he said. 30 is a significant milestone, the entry to a decade where many people truly come into their own, where the foundation of early adulthood supports increasingly authentic choices and directions. You're beginning this decade with remarkable clarity and courage, and I look forward to seeing how you build on that foundation in the years ahead. The words, straightforward, sincere, unalloyed with subtle messages about family obligation or implicit expectations, felt like a gift in themselves. They acknowledged the significance of my journey without demanding particular outcomes, celebrated my growth without claiming credit for it, and expressed genuine interest in my future without attempting to shape or direct it. As I left the cafe, documents and wooden box carefully secured in my bag, I felt a profound sense of alignment, as if disparate elements of my experience were finally converging into a coherent whole. The financial security my grandfather had intended for me was being restored, not just through the repayment plan for the primary trust, but through this supplemental fund I had qualified for through my own demonstrated responsibility and independence. The family patterns that had shaped my development were being acknowledged and addressed, not just within my immediate family, but across generational lines through connections with Thomas and Margaret. Most significantly, I was moving from a position of reaction to established dynamics toward one of conscious creation of the relationships and boundaries that would shape my adult life. This transition, from responding to patterns others had established to defining terms of engagement based on my own values and needs, represented the most meaningful gift I could have received on this milestone birthday. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.